concerned that there is a serious intent to kill a very large proportion of the population of the world. And when I looked at the vaccines, I had a number of concerns. One was all four of them, so that was the Janssen, J&J, AstraZeneca, Pfizer and Moderna, they all were fundamentally the same design, whether they used mRNA or a viral communicated DNA. So the design of them, I would say, it was toxic by design. It was always going to harm people. Next, unlike a classical vaccine, which is usually a killed piece or killed preparation of the infective organism in a little bit of oil or alum, something like that, that's a unit dose, so you know how much you're injecting to each person. With these vaccines, we're giving a unit dose of code. Now, that code could be taken up well, copied into protein very efficiently, and might do so for a long time in one person. In another person, it might be taken up badly, copied inefficiently, and only briefly. So what I'm saying, and I'm absolutely certain about this as a pharmacologist and a toxicologist, is by choosing this design, the range of outcomes is probably 1,000 times worse than it would be for a conventional vaccine, because the actual amount of protein produced will vary by orders of magnitude more. It will. And I thought that was the explanation for why it is that many people had no side effects whatsoever, and others appeared to die. People would say, how could that possibly be true? And I just explained it, that with an encoded vaccine, an unlucky individual might take up large quantities of it in their heart, in the coronary vessels, or in the cerebral veins in their head, and produce lots of spike protein for a long time. And those people might get myocarditis or cerebral vein sinus thrombosis and die. And someone else, it might be spread around the body in a sort of less dangerous place and not make so much spike protein. I thought that was an adequate explanation. But I don't think that's not the whole explanation anymore. The reason I thought it was an explanation was I made an assumption, which I was entitled to make, which is that the same stuff from a given manufacturer is in every single vial. Little glass vaccine vial. I believed and was entitled to believe that within a fraction of a percent, we had the same consistent quality and purity in every single injection, and therefore the observed variation in behaviour in people must be down to something such as the thing I just suggested. But as I'm going to come on to, unfortunately, we're now absolutely certain it's not the same stuff in every vial, and that means criminal acts are being committed. I am prepared to state and to prove that means it's not the same material in the lots that have produced bad side effects. I mean, what I've just told you, you may not appreciate the significance of it. It's not the same stuff. So if you thought it was the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine that was used in the clinical trials, some of the batches contain something different. They are lying, and I can use the L word all the time. If they want to come and sue me, do you know what? I would welcome it. You will lose, you guys. You will lose. So by all means, put me in my place and sue me. I look forward to seeing you in court.
I have no doubt that if we talk to all of the experts who we've spoken to, the psychologists, the psychiatrists, the epidemiologists, immunologists, the lawyers, the economists, they will all come to the same conclusion. This is intentional, premeditated mass murder. There's absolutely no doubt about it.
Now the full video.
What did they say? Well, they told us things like, this is an extremely lethal virus. If you catch it, get ill, you really could die. And remember the falling man face down in Wuhan. It's never happened anywhere else. It was pure theatre. And it turns out that it's not a particularly lethal virus. If it exists at all, it's about the same as a bad seasonal influenza. They used PCR testing repeatedly off swabs up noses and throats, and led you to believe that these were highly accurate and could distinguish a clinically infected person from something that's not. And even the inventor, Kary Mullis, who's died, won a Nobel Prize for this technique, said you should never use it for this purpose. So I won't waste any more time, but they're still using these damn tests, and they're not reliable. They don't tell you anything, really. They also say you should wear masks, but masks have been extensively studied. Cloth masks, if anything, make you more likely to catch an unusual bacterial pneumonia because you're breathing through a filthy cloth. And the blue medical masks, they're not masks actually, they're splash guards. Their purpose in hospitals is to stop blood and bodily fluid going into the nose and mouth of the attending healthcare worker. They've never been for filtering your breath, and obviously they don't do so. But they've told you to wear masks, and I think the purpose, certainly in me, it causes anxiety. I feel really awful wearing these things. Then they introduced lockdowns where you were all to stay at home, mostly, unless you were a poor manual worker, and then you had to go out to work. But the intelligentsia pretty much got paid to stay at home for very long periods of time, 3 months initially in the case of Britain. Lockdowns, they told us, would slow the spread of transmission of this virus, and lots of people thought it must obviously be so because it's a disease spread from person to person. But it didn't chime with me, and I'm embarrassed to say it took me months to realise why they wouldn't work. And it comes to this next lie, the idea of asymptomatic transmission, that you could be bearing the virus in your airways, yet have no symptoms, but nevertheless be able to spread enough of the stuff to infect a person nearby. That's not true. That's a flat lie. And whenever a scientific advisor, medical advisor to a government tells you things like asymptomatic transmission, I want you to know that they're not mistaken. They're lying, because it's been studied and it's simply not true. And I can append a link to the notes for this program, which is an accumulation of statements by Fauci, a WHO doctor, and other people, actually, including me, goes through this argument. So if asymptomatic transmission doesn't occur, and I am certain it's epidemiologically irrelevant, I'm not saying it never occurs, but it's irrelevant. If it's irrelevant, why would you need to wear masks if you're well? Why would you need to test somebody who's not got symptoms? Why would you need to close your business or your school or the economy? So again, they've lied to you with the objective of both frightening you and I think also learning from financially experienced people. The other objective was to begin to destroy the economy and the sovereign currencies. And I think that's a continuing objective. They also lied to us and told us that there were no treatments for this respiratory viral infection. And I will take my hat off to Dr. Peter McCulloch as a leader, but he's representative of very many brave physicians who pushed back on this nihilism. And they have determined half a dozen really quite good therapies used progressively. So early on you want to treat replication, in the middle phase, inflammation, and in the terminal phase, coagulation. And if you understand this multi-phase infection, you come to the conclusion, which is mine, that this is the most treatable respiratory viral illness ever. It's really quite surprising. But the use of those treatments are denied almost all around the world, to the extent that people will be fined or even struck off as physicians. There's another lie there. And then they would say things like, well, we're not sure when you've had it if you've become immune. Well, I would say Immunology 101 tells you that's simply not true. We know that the default understanding would be once you've shrugged off this virus, you will have taken high-resolution pictures of it, as it were, using your immune system. And if you see it again or something related to it, like a variant, you will not get clinically ill, not for months, possibly many years. So that's another lie. And then the final one, and we'll come back to this, is that vaccines are safe and effective, but that's a whole other story. So I've said that the evidence of a supranational plan is discarding of simple, well-established pandemic preparedness plans and replacing them with this bunch of lies. And all the countries did it. And if someone would like to write to me with an explanation, an innocent explanation for this, I'd love to hear it. I want to be wrong, but unfortunately I don't think I am. So if the motive is fear, I think the ultimate aim is control. And we will come onto this. The control mechanism that we can see being installed all around us are the so-called vaccine passports. A certificate first on paper and eventually a QR code on your phone that tells anyone who needs to know that you have received the requisite number of doses of these materials. Again, we'll come back to this, but that's nonsense. Economic destruction, I think, is on its way. There was a person who's very experienced in the City of London, and I heard them phoning into a radio show 3 weeks ago, And they said, I don't know anything about viruses, they said, but I do know a lot about finance. And they said, the amount of money, it's not even being borrowed, they've just printed it, actually created new money with an IOU from the government, haven't sold gilt-edged certificates to investors. He said, it is my view that the sovereign currency is already destroyed, and the exchange rates ought to be moving violently against each other, and they're not, if you go and look. And that's because, as Catherine Austin-Fitts tells us, this is a conspiracy led by the central banking clique and their clients to take over the world, I think. Once they've done that, destroyed the economy, again, I'm paraphrasing from Catherine, a great financial reset, which will have us using our Vax passes as digital ID and central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, which you can look up. They are real and they are being talked about by all central banks. You won't like those. You really won't. It'll be the end of cash and of any privacy of any transaction. I know I go further than many, but I'm really quite concerned that there is a serious intent to kill a very large proportion of the population of the world. Again, I hope I'm wrong, but all of the measures required to get to this point of control through vaccine passports, digital ID, also, and to repeatedly vaccinate people, as we'll come on to, they certainly set the scene where a bad actor could introduce a gene sequence that will rob you of your health and kill you in a fairly predictable way at a fairly predictable rate per million doses and so on. So if somebody does want to depopulate, the setup is so perfect that it isn't completely crazy. Before I move on to the vaccines, and this is a concern I had, lots of people have said to me, Mike, this cannot possibly be the way you describe it. It looks compelling, I understand, but come on, you can't have a global conspiracy like this. It would leak, and it involves far too many people. You must be wrong. There must be another explanation. And I suggest to them that they look for a video on YouTube, surprisingly, by a German journalist called Paul Schreier, Streyer, Paul Schreier. And there's a 1-hour documentary called Pandemic Simulations, Preparation for a New Era, ? And when you watch that, your last rickety defence is that this isn't a well-organised, long-planned event, I think will disappear and your heart will be in your boots by 20 minutes. Basically, all of the actors that you see around the table, including, say, in the event 201 that took place at the end of 2019, all of those players are currently taking the roles they had in the simulations and are all around the world doing exactly the things they did in the simulation. So that was the rehearsal. Those were the rehearsals, and there were more than a dozen of these damn things. And I think one of the bitterest moments for me was to realise that we were doing it to ourselves, that the US, UK, New Zealand, Australia and Canada, the Five Eyes, I think are the leading players. I don't know. I'm not going to say Russia's not involved or whatever, but it looks like the Edward Bernays School of Psychological Management has been used by the military intelligence people, and they've directed their weapons at their own people for 2 years through all these lies, repetitive messaging. And so what we want to do is to wake people up, because if we don't wake up, we are finished as a set of liberal democracies. I'm going to turn to the vaccines, but before I do that, I'll pause in case Rhino or others would want to steer me differently. But I'll say two things that they're not original sayings, but they strike me as very appropriate. I've seen on many message boards, when this comes out, when this all comes out, don't ask me how I knew. Ask yourself why you didn't. I mean, honestly, the evidence that things are amiss, I think, is so stark that you literally have to avert your eyes not to realise that things are really bad everywhere. And then this other thing, it's an old saying, I've heard this before, it makes me chuckle a little bit. If you're one step ahead of everybody else, you can be seen as a genius. If you're 2 steps ahead, you're a lunatic. And that's, I'm afraid, what I've been. My job as a scientist was to spot faint patterns in sparse data. That's what you do when you're trying to work out something that's new. And so I think I have been a couple of steps ahead and probably sometimes wrong, but broadly, I think it is, sadly, roughly what I've said. So, Rainer, you can either wave me onwards or you might want to ask any questions about that.
Mike, you're right on track. This
Okay.
is so important to hear this little introduction because it gives us an overview. Many of our viewers have only seen bits and pieces of this, so this gives them the whole picture. This is great. You're right on track.
All right, thank you. And Corvin, yes, if you could have the presentation available, I'll talk for a little bit, and then maybe we can pop those slides up because I'll come back to that. But a colleague's done an analysis that's, I think, quite striking when you see that. So to the vaccines. So I worked for the biopharmaceutical industry for 32 years. So I think you can take it as read, but I'll say it again. I am pro-innovative new medicines, provided they're well-developed, used appropriately, and of course the profile is safe enough considering the utility. So if you were treating a terminal cancer that had evaded surgery, current chemotherapy, radiotherapy, and so on, then you might be willing to take a drug that might kill 10% of the people. I don't know, 5%. If it might stretch your life out for many years, especially if you're offered the chance of a cure. And some of these gene-based vaccines, I think the original intent of people like Dr. Malone and others was indeed to treat things like that. You could put a protein from your cancer into one of these vaccines and force your immune system to recognize it and destroy it. And that could provide exquisitely safe novel chemotherapy. But if you're going to treat effectively everyone on the planet, and you shouldn't do it anyway, but that's certainly the stated intent, you need safety, as Peter McCullough would say. That's your first concern. Even more than does it work, you need to make sure it's very safe, because you're going to be giving it potentially to billions of people. Now, I did say that my original training included toxicology, and I was taught by at least two people that founded the discipline of mechanistic toxicity. I can't remember their names now, Professor Jim Bridges and somebody else, Dennis Park. And they reminded us that in the 1950s, we didn't do toxicology in the drug industry. They would give it to 2 dogs and 5 chickens, and if the drug didn't kill them, they literally would start giving them to people. That's how bad things were 60 or 70 years ago. We had some strong wake-up calls at the end of the 60s, 50s, 60s, early 60s, with thalidomide, for example. It's a case that most people know about. At the time, they thought that babies were safe in mother's womb, and so wouldn't be a problem if you gave a pregnant woman a drug. And we now know that their fetus is exquisitely sensitive to perturbations in their environment. And so we never, ever give novel medical interventions to pregnant women, right? We'll come back to that, so we're definitely doing that. So because of my toxicological training and sort of a good understanding of what was required in drug R&D, new drug R&D, as soon as I looked at the vaccines, I was really quite frightened because they were a novel type. These had never been mass dosed to human beings at all. So there would be no way of knowing what kind of effects, unwanted effects that might come about. And of course, what you do is careful empirical study. You should do all of the possible studies that, if you have a worry, rule of thumb would be, if you can think of a worry, you need to show why it's not going to happen. To design an appropriate experiment. You have to try and drown your own puppy, as we used to call it. It's not a good job, but you have to do it. You can't just hope it'll be all right on the night. It rarely is. And when I looked at the vaccines, I had a number of concerns. One was all 4 of them, so that was the Janssen, J&J, AstraZeneca, Pfizer, and Moderna. They all were fundamentally the same design, whether they used mRNA or a viral communicated DNA. They encoded only the spike protein, the sort of sticky out bit from the ball and stick model of the virus that you've got. And I don't know to this day how they all chose just the spike protein, because I guessed, and we now know it's true, that human immunity relies much more on understanding the depth, the molecular structure inside the ball than the spikes. So I thought it was bad, just immunologically uneducated thing, just to pick the outside part. But secondly, it took me, no more than half an hour of searching for research papers, abstracts, and so on. Not so much on coronavirus spike protein, because it's relatively new, but similar external proteins on other viruses. And within the half an hour, I realised that all of them have some kind of biological properties that are unwelcome. They're not just for anchoring the virus to the surface of a cell, which they do, but they're also biologically active, as you might expect, really. They interact with the immune system and also coagulation system. So, in fact, I saw Wolfgang Rodarg earlier, and he led off, and I joined a two-person a petition to the European Medicines Agency to say, don't approve these vaccines at this time. Here are a handful of concerns that we think are going to occur, and you need to slow down. And I think 2 of the 4 have been tested and proved correct, and the third one was looking pretty ropey. So the design of them, I would say, it was toxic by design. It was always going to harm people. Next, unlike a classical vaccine, which is usually a killed piece or killed preparation of the infective organism in a little bit of oil or alum, something like that. That's a unit dose, so you know how much you're injecting to each person. With these vaccines, we're giving a unit dose of code. Now, that code could be taken up well, copied into protein very efficiently, and might do so for a long time in one person. In another person, it might be taken up badly, copied inefficiently, and briefly. So what I'm saying, and I'm absolutely certain about this as a pharmacologist and a toxicologist, is by choosing this design, the range of outcomes is probably 1,000 times worse than it would be for a conventional vaccine, because the actual amount of protein produced will vary by orders of magnitude more. It will. And I thought that was the explanation for why it is that many people had no side effects whatsoever, and others appeared to die. People would say, how could that possibly be true? And I just explained it, that with an encoded vaccine, an unlucky individual might take up large quantities of it in their heart, in the coronary vessels, or in the cerebral veins in their head, and produce lots of spike protein for a long time. And those people might get myocarditis or cerebral vein sinus thrombosis and die. And someone else, it might be spread around the body in a sort of less dangerous place and not make so much spike protein. I thought that was an adequate explanation, but I don't think that's not the whole explanation anymore. The reason I thought it was an explanation was I made an assumption, which I was entitled to make, which is that the same stuff from a given manufacturer is in every single vial. Little glass vaccine vial. I believed and was entitled to believe that within a fraction of a percent, we had the same consistent quality and purity in every single injection, and therefore the observed variation in behaviour in people must be down to something such as the thing I just suggested. But as I'm going to come on to, unfortunately, we're now absolutely certain it's not the same stuff in every vial. And that means criminal acts are being committed. So we will come on to that. Just before we do that, vaccines. Normally a vaccine, if you administer it to a person, would usually be 1 dose, sometimes 2. There's never going to be a whole train of them. I'm seeing some countries already given the 4th vaccine, and others have talked about an open-ended series. You need to know vaccines are not like that. You do not need to be repeatedly dosed with something that would earn the title vaccine. 1 or 2 doses at most. So if it's more than that, it's not public health, and it's not public health. But here's the thing. A vaccine ought to, at minimum, I think, prevent you becoming ill with the pathogen against which you've been vaccinated. If it doesn't do that, I'm afraid it's not a vaccine. And as a consequence of protecting you against that organism, and it does that usually by killing off a new infection in an early stage before you're even symptomatic, that would mean you should have low viral load in your airway. So that's what keeps you safe after vaccination, or if you've acquired immunity. And the consequence of that is it usually reduces, if not stops, transmission. And we know now, lots of work in the literature, that people who've had this virus are immune to becoming ill a second time from either the original virus or a variant. And they don't transmit either. So we can see what good immunity can look like, because we've seen lots of cases of natural immunity. And authorities do agree. They concede that these vaccines do not prevent you catching it. They don't prevent you growing the same amount in your airway as an unvaccinated person, and they don't prevent transmission. So if someone's going to claim that they reduce the severity of your symptoms, I'd like to know what black magic is invoked, because I've just told you, it goes to your airway, it grows in the same way and transmits in the same way. I actually don't believe there's no mechanism now for this to suddenly intervene and stop you getting ill. I don't believe it. So I think the most likely outcome now is they don't do anything useful at all, but they are unfortunately really very harmful. They're certainly toxic. So just a brief introduction, I think, to one of the best tracking systems in the world, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, VAERS. It's a US system. It was put in place about 30 years ago, and anyone who has an adverse event following vaccination, even if they don't not necessarily claiming it's necessarily caused by it, but in order to track the possibility, you're urged to report that. But unfortunately, the reporting rate is typically between 1% and 10% of adverse events, and there's every piece of evidence that has continued in recent years. In the recent year since the vaccine started rolling out. And yet there have been more adverse events and certainly many more deaths associated just with the COVID-19 vaccines than all the other vaccines in history that have been taken through this VAERS system. So there is no question. It's public data. It's your database. It's not mine. I haven't put anything in it. 85% of the reports were put in there by qualified healthcare professionals. So it's not true, as some have asserted, that, well, people are just putting in, spoiler claims and they're not real. They are absolutely real. There is something called the